Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is an expectation of precision. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and well, the doctor points at the screen and says, there it is.
Right. Yeah. It is binary. It is either broken or not broken.
Yes, precisely. It is a clean, visible categorization. And that gives us a lot of comfort. We really like things to be visible and easily defined. But then you step into the world of divine justice, and, well, that x-ray machine suddenly seems broken.
It really does. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Right. We start looking at a theological landscape that gets muddy fast, especially when we try to apply human metrics to the Creator.
I mean, when we try to take the scales of human justice, which are, so often reactive and flawed, and we map them onto an infinite being, the categories just start breaking down.
Yeah, that is spot on. So today we are doing a deep dive into a specific set of texts. We are looking at excerpts from John Owen's A Dissertation on Divine Justice, specifically focusing on chapter 16.
And this is an incredible text because it drops us right into a brilliant, high-stakes intellectual brawl.
It really is a brawl. Our mission for this deep dive is to investigate a rigorous theological debate between John Owen, a theologian named Johannes Piscator, and Dr. William Twisse.
Right. Those are the three main voices we are tracking here.
And the central question we're posing to you, the listener, is this. Does God punish sin because he simply decides to do it, or because his very nature demands it?
That is the core of it, yeah.
And if his nature demands it, does that make him a captive to rules, or is that the purest definition of freedom?
To set the proper historical and intellectual context here, we have to understand the giants involved in this debate.
Yeah, tell us about Piscator first, since he sort of starts the whole thing.
Well, Johannes Piscator laid down the initial argument we will be dissecting today. He was a highly regarded Strasbourg-born theologian. He lived from 1546 to 1626.
Okay, so late 16th, early 17th century.
Right. He worked as a divinity professor at Herborn. He was also a massive figure in German Bible translation. And he wrote extensive notes pushing back against the thinker named Conrad Vorstius.
Wow. Okay, so he has a lot of credibility.
Absolutely. Piscator brings a very specific argument about the nature of God's justice to the table.
And pushing back against Piscator is Dr. William Twisse. Now, we have to be careful here, right? Because it is easy to read Owen's defense and view Twisse as a punching bag or, like, a straw man.
Oh, yeah. Twisse was anything but a lightweight. Far from it.
I mean, the text calls him a celebrated antagonist.
Yeah, William Twisse was the prolocutor of the Westminster Assembly. He was a titanic figure in 17th century scholasticism, an incredibly rigorous supralapsarian thinker, and someone whose intellectual weight was respected across Europe.
So he is not just some random guy arguing on the internet of the 1600s.
Not at all. Twisse takes Piscator's arguments and launches a devastating series of critiques. Twisse is operating from a position known as theological voluntarism.
And that is the idea that God's will is the absolute, unconditioned standard of what is just right.
Correct. He argues forcefully against anything that seems to limit God's freedom of choice.
Which brings us to John Owen. Owen steps into the ring to defend Piscator's main conclusion against Twisse's attacks.
And Owen is arguably the greatest English theologian of his era.
Yeah, and what is wild is that he notes in the text that he only had a few leisure hours to write this defense due to his insane schedule.
I love that detail.
Yeah.
The man had a few spare hours on a Tuesday afternoon and cranked out a masterclass on the mechanics of divine justice.
It makes you feel very unproductive, doesn't it?
Just a little bit, yeah.
But what I love about Owen's approach is that he refuses to be a blind loyalist. He explicitly states that disciples of Christ ought to call none on earth master in matters of religion.
Right. He does not agree with every single phrasing Piscator uses.
Exactly. Wait, I mean, that is spot on. He sets aside the anxious search afterwards and the minutiae of similes to focus on the core truth of the matter.
So let us get into Piscator's initial argument, which relies heavily on a specific metaphor from Hebrews 12.29.
That text describes God as a consuming fire.
Yes, and Piscator takes this metaphor and builds a philosophical argument around it. He argues that just as physical fire burns combustible material by a natural necessity, God punishes sin by a natural necessity when it is presented before his justice.
Think about the physics of a fire, If you throw a dry branch into a roaring blaze, the fire does not stop, analyze the wood, and calculate whether it should burn it.
Right, the property of its nature guarantees the branch will ignite.
And Piscator applies this directly to the divine nature. He is saying God, from the perfection of his justice, cannot avoid punishing sin when it is presented before that justice.
It sounds straightforward on the surface.
I mean, I can immediately see why Twisse would have a massive problem with that, though. It makes God sound like an unthinking, mechanical force of nature.
Yeah, Twisse asks, if God is just a roaring fire, reacting blindly to whatever is thrown into it, where is the divine intellect? Where is the sovereign will?
Right. And this is where Owen steps in with a critical correction. He agrees with Piscator's conclusion that God must punish sin, but he entirely rejects the idea of absolute necessity in the way a physical fire operates.
Yes, Owen insists God is not a blind, inanimate force. He calls God a rational and intelligent fire.
And that distinction changes the entire landscape of the debate.
It really does. Piscator's phrasing, left unchecked, leaves the door wide open to view God as a mechanical force reacting to stimuli. Owen shuts that door firmly.
He insists that God works as an intelligent agent.
Right. To reconcile the necessity of justice with the intelligence of God, Owen brings in the concept of concomitant liberty.
Concomitant liberty. Okay, let us break that down for the listener.
This means the necessity of the action runs parallel with the complete freedom of the agent's will.
Let me offer an analogy to clarify how this works mechanically. We are talking about the difference between a chemical reaction and the jurisprudence of a perfectly honest judge.
Oh, that is a great way to look at it.
A chemical reaction has no choice. You mix vinegar and baking soda and it fizzes. The reaction is an absolute blind necessity.
Right, there's no intellect involved there.
But now, look at a perfectly honest, flawless judge. This judge has a brilliant mind, a distinct will, and complete agency. But this judge's character is so purely aligned with the law that it is functionally impossible for him to accept a bribe.
Right. He is not forced by a physical law like gravity.
Exactly. Or rather, I should say, he is bound by his own unyielding character.
That is a highly precise way to frame the mechanics. The judge acts by necessity, meaning he cannot take the bribe, but he executes that necessity with complete freedom of understanding and will.
And that is the essence of concomitant liberty. God's justice demands action, but he executes it with a free, intelligent will.
Yes, the action is necessary, but the agent acting is entirely free in the execution of it.
So with that framework in place, we see Dr. Twisse launch his first major attack. Twisse zeroes in on this very concept of necessity.
He does. Twisse argues that any necessity of nature automatically excludes all kinds of liberty.
In Twisse's mind, if God must act, he is not free. Freedom, for Twisse, requires the ability to choose an alternate path.
Right. If the fire must burn the wood, the fire has no liberty. Therefore, if God must punish sin, God has no liberty.
Twisse is applying a very strict definition of freedom here. He equates freedom with the ability to choose between contraries.
Yes, if you cannot choose option B, you are not free in choosing option A.
But Owen spots the flaw in that reasoning right away. Twisse is attacking a straw man because he is applying the rules of inanimate objects to a divine, intellectual being.
Twisse's arguments only apply to a blind necessity, like the chemical reaction we mentioned earlier.
They do not accurately target the kind of intellectual necessity Owen is defending.
Right. So Owen clarifies what Piscator intended. God acts by a natural necessity, strictly in the sense that by nature he cannot do otherwise.
Supposing sin exists, the strict demands of his justice mean he cannot act otherwise than to punish it.
But to explain why this does not encroach on God's liberty, Owen dives into the philosophical nature of the will itself. In 17th century faculty psychology, the will is understood as an intellectual appetite.
Right.
Freedom of action is the very essence of the will.
Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I follow. Owen is saying God has no choice but to punish sin, but he is still completely free.
That is what he's arguing, yes.
Because that sounds like a contradiction wrapped in theological double talk, you know? If I am forced to do something, I am not free.
Well, it depends on what is forcing you.
I mean, if I am forced to pay my taxes, I'm doing it out of necessity. But I certainly do not feel free while doing it. How can God be bound by his nature, unable to choose the contrary, but still be totally free?
It is a vital question. To resolve it, we have to look at the source of the constraint. When you feel forced to pay taxes, you feel trapped because the force is external.
The government is an outside entity imposing a demand.
Yeah, a demand that contradicts your internal desire to keep your money. That is coercion. But for God, the demand does not come from the outside.
There is no external law of justice sitting above God, forcing him to comply against his wishes.
Correct. The demand comes from his own perfect internal character.
Hmm.
He is acting in total agreement with who he is. When a being acts in complete, unhindered alignment with its truest, most perfect desires, that is not coercion. That is the pinnacle of freedom.
Okay, I see the distinction now. The constraint is internal perfection, not external coercion.
Yeah.
It is like a man who loves his wife perfectly. He is bound to be faithful to her by his own character, but he does not experience that fidelity as a prison.
Right. He experiences it as the free expression of his love.
Yeah.
The human mind is naturally inclined toward happiness.
Uh,
You cannot choose to want to be miserable for the sake of sheer misery, right? Your will is naturally inclined toward seeking satisfaction.
Yet you pursue that happiness freely.
Spot on. The natural inclination does not destroy your freedom. It provides the context for it. Similarly, God's nature demands justice, but he executes that justice freely because his will is perfectly aligned with his nature.
But if God's character is this inescapable wall of justice that must punish sin by a necessity of nature, it begs an obvious question. Why isn't the world vaporized the millisecond we do something wrong?
Well, that is exactly where Twisse goes next.
Yeah.
This is where Twisse sets his second trap regarding the timing of divine justice.
Right. Twisse argues that if God acts from a necessity of nature, he must react instantly. The moment a sin occurs, the punishment must drop.
Go back to the physical fire metaphor. The instant the paper touches the flame, it burns. There is no delay.
And Twisse uses this to argue that if Piscator and Owen are right, God has no choice but to punish sin the millisecond it is committed.
Yes, and since God obviously delays punishment, Twisse concludes the necessity argument must be false.
It is a brilliant piece of logical maneuvering by Twisse, I have to admit. He looks at the empirical reality of delayed judgment in the world and uses it to attack the metaphysical premise of natural necessity.
Right. If necessity equals instant reaction and reactions are not instant, then there is no necessity.
And Owen handles this by making a razor-sharp distinction between the principle of acting and the mode of acting.
Okay, let's unpack
The
that.
principle is the what and the why. God's nature requires that he act justly. That is the principle. The mode is the when and the how.
Right. The necessity of his nature guarantees that justice will be served, but his infinite wisdom dictates the timing and the method of the administration.
Owen uses a highly effective analogy right in the text to demonstrate this. He asks us to consider God speaking.
Yes, this is a great analogy. Because of his nature, God is absolute truth. Therefore, when God speaks, he must speak truly. God cannot lie.
The principle of truth is a natural necessity. However, God still speaks freely. He chooses when to speak, whom to speak to, and what specific words to use.
The necessity of truth does not rob him of the freedom of administration.
Right. The necessity guarantees the character of the action, but infinite wisdom governs the execution.
Think about how this alters our understanding of history.
Oh, absolutely. You look at the world and see wrongs that seem to go unanswered for decades, sometimes centuries.
And the natural human response, much like Twisse's logic, is to assume that justice must be optional. Maybe God just let that one slide.
But Owen's framework demands a different conclusion. Just because justice is not immediate does not mean it is optional.
Correct. The timing is being handled by a free, intelligent creator. The check is guaranteed by his nature, but the delivery date is set by his wisdom.
So Twisse, seeing that his timing argument fails to break the concept of necessity, scales up his attack. If God is not forced to act instantly, is he forced to act with maximum force?
Yes, Twisse brings a serious charge here, basically leveling an accusation of blasphemy against Piscator.
Wow, blasphemy. That is a heavy charge.
Twisse argues that if God is like a fire acting by natural necessity, he would burn with all his force. Therefore, every single punishment for every single offense would require God to use the absolute maximum of his omnipotence.
Twisse is saying that if God is compelled by his nature to punish, he has to empty the entire tank of his divine strength every time he acts.
Yes. Twisse labels this idea absurd and blasphemous because it implies God exhausts himself or has no nuance in his judgments.
It would mean every minor infraction receives a punishment of infinite, universe-destroying magnitude.
Now, I have heard people try to explain omnipotence using the analogy of a sports car. They say if you have a car capable of driving 200 miles per hour, you do not drive it at that speed in a school zone.
Yeah, I have heard that one. But that analogy always feels a little thin to me when we are talking about divine attributes.
It does. It explains capability, but it lacks the philosophical weight of how God's nature constrains his might. How does Owen actually dismantle Twisse's argument here?
Well, Owen dismantles it by correcting Twisse's misunderstanding of the relationship between justice and omnipotence.
Right. Twist assumes that a natural necessity to act means a necessity to act to the absolute limit of one's capability.
And Owen counters that God's nature requires him to punish as far as is just, not as far as he is able. The limiting principle is justice, not raw capability.
Let me propose a different analogy, something a bit more mechanical. Think of a massive industrial steam engine.
Okay, I am with you.
The boiler generates an immense amount of pressurized steam, representing raw force. But if that steam is just released all at once in an uncontrolled explosion, it is destructive and useless.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The engine is strong because of its unyielding structural constraints, the valves and cylinders that direct the steam to perform precise work. Without the constraints, the energy just dissipates impotently.
Oh, that is a fantastic analogy. God's omnipotence is the raw energy, but his justice is the structural constraint that directs it.
He does not just release maximum destructive force randomly. He applies the exact amount of force required by justice.
That is a much stronger way to conceptualize it. And Owen takes this to a broader theological point regarding God's omnipotence in general.
Yes, God does not use his omnipotence out of absolute necessity in any of his external works.
If God decides to act outside himself, he acts omnipotently, meaning he acts with divine capability. But he does not do everything he is capable of doing.
Owen points out that God could have created more worlds. He has the infinite capability to create 1 billion more galaxies. But he chose not to.
Therefore, the fact that he acts necessarily in the execution of justice does not mean he must exhaust his omnipotence every time he acts. The punishment is tailored to fit the crime.
He assigns the degrees, the duration, and the extension of punishment according to the specific demerit of the sin.
And here's where we hit a massive theological pivot in the text. Because God is an intelligent fire, not a blind physical force, his infinite wisdom allows him to do something a physical fire could never do.
Right, he can transfer this punishment to a surety.
This is where the mechanics of Owen's argument lock into the core of Reformed soteriology.
A physical fire cannot burn a different log to spare the one you threw into it. A chemical reaction cannot substitute a different compound to save the one reacting.
But God, operating with concomitant liberty and infinite wisdom, can accept a voluntary substitute to satisfy the demands of his natural justice.
Now, most of our listeners understand the basic concept of a substitute Christ taking the place of the sinner. But we need to look closely at the legal mechanics of how this transfer works under Owen's framework.
Right, because if Twisse is right, and justice is just an arbitrary rule God invented, then the mechanics of substitution do not really matter.
God can just wave a wand and forgive everyone.
Under Twisse's voluntarist view, God could simply relax his own rules. But under Owen's essentialist view, the debt of justice is an inescapable reality of the divine nature.
The debt must be cleared. This means the transfer of guilt to the surety cannot be a legal fiction. It has to be an actual satisfaction of justice.
Owen maintains a careful distinction here between the macula, the stain or moral pollution of sin, and the riatus, the legal liability to punishment.
That distinction is so critical. The surety does not become morally polluted by the sin. He does not take on the macula.
But he absolutely takes on the riatus. The legal liability is genuinely transferred to him, and the natural necessity of God's justice falls upon the surety with full force.
The fact that a substitute is required at all proves Owen's point against Twisse.
If God's justice were purely optional, like a policy he drafted up one day, he could just change the policy and issue a blanket pardon without requiring any satisfaction.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, the necessity of the cross proves that justice is an essential attribute of who God is, not an arbitrary decree.
This naturally brings up a fundamental question about the origin of God's rights. Where do these rules of justice come from?
Does God have rights over his creation because he is God by nature, or because he decided to give himself rights?
This pushes us into Twisse's fourth major attack, centering on the concept of divine right.
Twisse grounds his attack in a famous biblical phrase from Genesis 18.25, Abraham's question. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?
Twisse looks at this and argues that God only has rights based on his own free appointment.
According to Twisse, without a prior free decision by God to establish a system of rights and justice, no right exists that God is forced to exercise.
So Twisse is arguing that God sat down, drew up a constitution for the universe, and gave himself the right to judge.
And because he wrote the Constitution freely, He's only bound by it because he continually chooses to be.
That is the core of theological voluntarism, right? The will determines what is right.
That is the voluntarist position, yes.
And this raises a massive red flag for me regarding arbitrary morality. If God's right to rule and punish is purely based on a free choice he made, could he simply choose not to have that right?
That is a very valid question.
If he wrote the Constitution, can he just tear it up and decide that murder is suddenly a virtue, or that he no longer has any authority over humans?
That is the exact logical vulnerability Owen attacks. Owen agrees that the initial act of creation was a free choice.
God freely decreed to create rational creatures. He was under no necessity to create the universe.
But, Owen argues, once those rational creatures are created, God's right of dominion and justice over them is natural and essential.
It is not an add-on. It is not a secondary decree up for debate.
It is baked into the ontology of the relationship.
Precisely. Owen points out the devastating metaphysical consequence of Twisse's logic.
Yes, if God's dominion depended entirely on a free, optional determination, then God could justly decide to renounce his lordship.
He could say, I no longer have dominion over you. This would mean a rational creature could exist without depending on a creator.
Which is logically incoherent. A creature, by definition, is a dependent being.
You cannot have a painting without a painter, and the painting cannot suddenly possess an independent existence completely severed from the fact that it was painted.
Subjection to the creator is built into the very definition of what a creature is.
Owen protects the logical coherence of reality here. The right to rule and the necessity to act justly are not hats God puts on and takes off at will.
They are the essential reality of who he is in relation to what he has made. This means morality and justice are not divine whims. They are the bedrock of existence.
This sets up the final showdown in the text. Twisse throws everything he has left at Piscator and Owen, bringing up concepts of antecedent evil, annihilation, and redefining omnipotence.
Let us break down this dispute over willing evil. Twisse expresses absolute astonishment at a claim Piscator made.
Piscator suggested that God could will evil antecedently to anyone without injuring his justice.
Now, Twisse finds fault with this primarily because he thinks Piscator is being inconsistent. Twisse says, if you believe God can just will evil on someone for no reason, why do you not also believe God can simply do good to a creature by pardoning its sin, regardless of its demerit?
To understand this, we need to clarify the difference between God's antecedent will and his consequent will in scholastic theology, right?
Yes. The consequent will refers to God's reaction to a creature's action, for example. God willing the punishment of a sinner consequent to their sin.
And the antecedent will refers to God willing something prior to any condition in the creature.
Twisse is trying to force Piscator into a corner where pardoning sin without any satisfaction of justice is deemed totally acceptable.
Twisse is basically saying, if you admit God can do things antecedently without regard to the creature's merit, you have to admit God can pardon a sinner antecedently without regard to justice.
How does Owen handle this trap?
Well, Owen steps in and clarifies the stance forcefully. He says that if God decreed to punish without regard to sin, it would indeed logically mean he could also let sin pass entirely unpunished.
But Owen forcefully rejects the premise that God can pardon sin without satisfying justice.
He argues that doing so, letting sin pass unpunished without a just satisfaction, would destroy God's own glory. It would completely subvert the dependence of rational creatures upon him.
Because if actions have no consequences, the moral order of the universe collapses.
If a human judge opens the prison doors and says, everyone is pardoned, regardless of what you did or what the law demands, that judge is not showing mercy. That judge is destroying the law itself.
Right. And Twisse, realizing this defense is holding strong, tries one final logical trap regarding annihilation.
Ah, yes. Twisse claims that if God must punish a sinner because of this natural necessity, he could not simply annihilate them back into nothingness.
If he annihilated them, there would be no one left to punish.
Twisse concludes that since God supposedly lacks the option to just erase a sinner from existence to avoid punishing them, God is not truly omnipotent under Piscator's and Owen's model.
He is using omnipotence as a trump card to shatter the necessity of justice. He is saying, your version of God is not all-powerful because he cannot even erase his own creations to avoid dealing with them.
Redefining omnipotence is tricky territory. How does Owen counter this without making God sound weak?
Owen delivers a definitive counter by demonstrating that Twisse's definition of omnipotence is deeply flawed.
Owen points out that there are many things God cannot do regarding his decrees that do not diminish his omnipotence in the slightest.
He uses a biblical fact. God could not break the bones of Christ on the cross because he had decreed otherwise through prophecy.
The prophecy had to be fulfilled, so the action of breaking the bones became an impossibility.
Yes. Owen states that a person must be deprived of reason to call that inability a lack of omnipotence.
Or consider a more fundamental attribute: God cannot lie. Does the inability to lie make God weak?
No, it proves his perfection. If there are many things God cannot do without any detraction from his omnipotence, why is he suddenly considered weak? Because his justice demands he cannot let sin pass unpunished.
Owen is completely flipping the script on Twisse. The inability to violate one's own perfect character is not a weakness. It is the ultimate strength.
This leads to what has to be Owen's mic drop moment in the entire dissertation. He makes a final, striking assertion regarding what true weakness actually looks like.
It is a devastating philosophical blow. Owen asserts that permitting a sinful creature to shake off its natural subjection and escape justice is not a mark of omnipotence.
It is a mark of impotence.
Yes.
True omnipotence cannot contradict perfect justice.
Let us think about that in the context of a human ruler. If a king has a law and a rebel breaks the law and the king just waves his hand and says, "I will just let it go," is that king showing how mighty he is?
Or is he showing that he is too weak to enforce his own laws?
He is showing impotence. He is showing he cannot maintain his own dominion over his territory.
Owen argues that a God who could simply shrug off his justice and let a rebel escape the consequences of defying the Creator would not be an all-powerful God.
He would be a God who had lost control of his own creation. The fact that God's justice is inescapable is the very proof of his absolute sovereign capability.
We have covered a massive amount of theological ground today.
We really have. We investigated John Owen's defense of Piscator against the formidable arguments of Dr. Twisse. We saw how God is not a blind, reactive fire.
He is an intelligent, rational fire whose perfect nature demands justice, yet whose infinite wisdom executes it freely, precisely, and righteously.
We saw how his necessity to act does not rob him of his liberty, but is instead the purest expression of it, free from external coercion.
We move through the timing of justice, understanding that delayed justice is managed by infinite wisdom.
We looked at the limits of punishment, seeing that justice, not raw capability, dictates the penalty.
And we confronted the reality that God's dominion is not an arbitrary decree, but an essential fact of creation, culminating in the understanding that true omnipotence perfectly upholds true justice.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We have spent this whole time dissecting the absolute, unyielding necessity of divine justice.
Yes, and if God's justice is so absolute that letting a creature escape it would be an act of impotence, how does that reframe your view of mercy?
It means true forgiveness could never be a simple wave of the hand or a brushing aside of the rules.
It necessitates a mechanism of justice so flawless that both the law and the lawbreaker are satisfied. Consider what it costs an omnipotent creator to remain perfectly just while offering grace.
Thank you for bringing these heavy, fascinating sources to the table. We conclude this deep dive knowing that stepping into these murky waters often reveals a foundation more solid than we ever imagined. Goodbye.